So, I wanted to read a passage for you guys to get into a context, a particular text that has, I believe, a Sukkot context. And it's a text that has a real kind of historical, very broad historical impact. Okay? If this stuff didn't happen, I don't know where we would be. This is from 1 Kings chapter 12. We have the story. It has, this says, then Jeroboam, or Yerovam, whose name, by the way, means whose people are many, he built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. And he went out from there and built Penuel. Penuel means God's face. So he builds this place. Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom will return to the house of David. If these people go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of his people will return to their Lord, even to Rehoboam, another king whose name means who enlarges the people, the king of Judah. And they will kill me and return to Rehoboam, king of Judah. So the king consulted and made 2 golden calves and said to them, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold your gods, O Israel, that brought you out from the land of Egypt. Sounds familiar? A little bit. Do you think history repeats? Did in this case. So what do we have here? Let me take you back into history. We have a divided kingdom. Remember, Shlomo is gone. His sons are taking over. And the kingdom is fractured. And part of the people want to follow the family of David. Right? But part of the people do not. So we have Jeroboam, who comes from Egypt at that time. He's living in Egypt. You know where his loyalties are, by the way. He comes back, and he is now set up as the king of the northern tribes of Israel. So he unifies the tribes. And something that he does is he says, I do not want my people, the northern Israelites that is, to go to Jerusalem to worship. Because if they go to Jerusalem to worship, they might think that David is their king. And then they're going to kill me. And my kingdom is done. And it's over. So he says, you know what? We're going to set up an alternative system. We're going to make up our own temple. We're going to have our own our own priests. We're going to have our own offerings. We're going to do everything. And the people will not have to go all the way down to Jerusalem. Because remember, this is a pilgrim feast. They're traveling from all over the place to Jerusalem. Well, where he sets this up is right there, Beit El, Shechem. If you know where that is, that's just directly north of Jerusalem. Okay? So, Judea, Samaria. And right there, he sets it up. So that anybody from the north will go down. They don't have to go down all the way to Jerusalem. They can stop right there in Shechem. They can stop Bethel. They can stop at Peniel. Now, there is some really important significance to those places because this is where the ark used to be stationed. This is where things were before they went to Jerusalem. But then they went to Jerusalem. So there's a little bit of a recapturing of the old glory, but what he does is very different. He sets up golden calves, and he says, these are your gods. These are your gods. How he was able to pull this off, I have no idea. But this is a moment in history that has changed so much. Because this is where the drift of the northern tribes from their brothers on the south began a very irreversible direction, essentially. The direction that would be corrected much later, but with a lot of pain and suffering. So, just to continue a little bit more, this is still same passage in Kings chapter 12, more verses. He says, he set one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. Where's Dan? Way up north. All the way by Syria. We're talking about the outer reaches of the northern Israel right now. Like when you're Dan, you're right there at the very, very top. So set up one in Bethel, so Samaria, and one in Dan. It says, now this thing became a sin for the people went to worship before the one as far as Dan. You're not supposed to go to Dan to worship. And then he made houses on high places, and he made priests from among all the people who were not of the sons of Levi. Jeroboam instituted a feast in the 8th month of the 15th day of the month, like the feast which is in Judah. And he went up to the altar, and thus he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves which he had made, and he instituted a feast for the sons of Israel, and went up to the altar to burn incense. Now, I want you to see what he's doing. He's setting up an alternative priesthood, alternative temples, alternative worship to Jerusalem, and he's even making a holiday that is just like the one in Judah on the 15th of the month, only a different month, a little bit before. Why? So we can catch the pilgrims coming down. Make it a little earlier. Make it a little easier, okay? Sivan is already passed, right? So we got Shavuot, and right there, we can do this. So do you see this as the imitation of the Sukkot celebration? Because that's what I see right here. And unfortunately, this caught on. People of northern Israel actually went for it. Some went and worshipped in Dan, and we still have archaeological remains of the altars that were found from Jeroboam's time. They're still there. The stones are still there. The four horned altars upon which people offered sacrifices in Dan are still there. And the remnants of Bethel are still there as well. We don't have quite as much over there to go on, but the stones are still there. People have been reconstructing. And this amazing event in history essentially has devastated Israel into two halves. Well, not even halves, because the northern tribes are so much more numerous. And the only people that stood apart were Judah in Jerusalem. And the northern tribes started their own religion, their own version of Judaism, their own sacrifices, their own priesthood, their own gods who brought them out of Egypt. And all of this was because of not wanting to be, sort of say, answering to the family of David. If you don't realize this, a lot of times these are tribal fights. These are tribal fights. At that time, the tribalism was much more of an obstacle than it was later in the history. God has healed us from that later on through events that were very difficult to survive. But at that time, people were divided along the tribal lines. So the idea of them not having to go down to Judah and do things in Judah was actually very appealing. And that's exactly what people did. So that divide brought a further fracturing of the people, a further breakup of the kingdoms, and it brought idolatry to the northern kingdom because they started sacrificing to all sorts of gods that were not God of Israel. Forget about the Canaanites who were pushing their own religion on them as well. So you kind of mix it all up together, and it comes out to be a real menace. So what happened later on is Jeroboam became king of northern Israel in 970 BCE, and then in the year 732 BCE, the northern kingdom, this is not Jeroboam, it's already a new king, his descendant, aligns himself with Syria, and he attacks Judah as a coalition. Now, northern kingdom of Israel decides to attack the southern kingdom of Israel, but they can't take them on their own. So what do? Syrians, come help us out. We'll wipe them out. And we'll take the plunder together. But what happens is Judah's king appeals to the Assyrians. He says, you guys got to help me out because these guys are in cahoots with Egypt. And if they take over us, Egypt's influence will be all over this land. So Assyrians come and they wipe out Syrians and they wipe out northern Israel. At that moment, they actually annex Syria for themselves. But they leave northern Israel alone. They said, you guys can figure this out. So the southern kingdom now has some influence over the northern kingdom. But when that happens, what do you think happens? I mean, you have to understand, southern kingdom of Israel and northern kingdom of Israel are like city of Atlanta and Roswell. Okay, so if you knew that Roswell was being attacked by the enemy, and you knew that Atlanta was safe, where would you run? Yeah, you're going to run to Atlanta. That's what you're going to do. You're going to call Uber, catch a cab, whatever you're going to do. You get on a train, you're going to go down there. And we're not talking about huge distances, by the way, because you know this is where the war line ends, because that king is in alliance with that king that's coming to wipe you out. So guess what? During that time, some of the northern Israelites went south, back to Judah. Why? They even had relatives, they had connections there to begin with. So there's a little bit of that. What happens in the 720 BCE, the Assyrians, they actually capture northern Israel, and at that point, more people flee to Judah. In 720 BCE, now, this is a new king in Assyria now. Tiglath-Pileser is gone. Sargon II comes, and he decides to wipe out northern Israel. He no longer has such strong alliances with Judah. He doesn't owe him anything. So he says, I'm taking over northern Israel. And he comes and he wipes out Samaria completely. He takes it over. He annexes it. Assyria is already theirs, so now they take over northern Israel. So Judah is still left alone, and they escape. They get lucky. But at that point, what do you think happens to the northern Israelites who are still living there? They once again flee south to Judah. And that brings me to this whole big teaching that you might have heard about the lost tribes. That they were just lost, gone. And if you know anything about war, and we know a lot about war, every time the war comes, we run. We run where? We don't sit and we wait. We run. We run where it's safe. My own family ran pretty bad during the war. They ran all the way to Siberia. From Bessarabia to Siberia. They got on the train, and as long as they could ride that train, they rode that train as far as they can get away from the Germans. This is what we do. We run. And something happened in antiquity that's very, very similar. So people talk about the 10 northern tribes being conquered, taken over, taken in Syria, taken in Babylon, being all gone. I want you to realize that many of those people went to Judah and lived there for years and years. And yes, eventually Jerusalem was also taken over, because then comes Nebuchadnezzar, okay, and he takes over Jerusalem as well. And then everyone goes to Babylon. And the northern Israelites who've been there from earlier time are now reunited with the southern Israelites who just recently arrived. And guess what? After being there for 70 years, God opens the doors and people return back. Cyrus allows people to return. And that's the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And when they come back, they're no longer Ephraim, Menashe, Dan, or anything. At that time, they're all a bunch of Jews. They're Judeans. They're the exiles who were brought out into the land that's not their own. And now they're returning back to the land, and they settle around Jerusalem regardless of their tribal affiliation. Because at this point, they just need to be able to rebuild one city, one spot, get a few farms going so that we can survive. At that point, the tribal separation becomes much less pronounced. And you would see at that point, the tribes essentially are all mixing together. So if you want to think of this as God reuniting the tribes, and actually I think that's what kind of sort of happened. There was a breakup along the tribal lines, and there was a reuniting along the tribal lines. And since that time, even the tribal system might have still continued on paper, if you want to call it that. For many people, the relationship between the tribal territories were no longer established as rigidly. Okay, this is where Simeon ends, and this is where Benjamin begins. Like, no, this was no longer like that. The borderlines were really erased, and the people were once again one people. So, something I want you to think about. What if none of these things have happened? Where would we be? But it all began with the sin of Jeroboam, a king who said, I'm going to set up my own alternative Judaism. We're going to pray our own way. We're going to have our own gods. We're going to have our own holidays. And we're going to compete with Jerusalem. Some people are still doing that today. They still are competing with Jerusalem. They're not willing to recognize where their roots are. They're not willing to come back. They're not willing to make the journey back. They would rather have their own alternative gods and alternative altars set up somewhere else. Fortunately, we know where it leads, so we'll be wiser.